Jackie Kennedy could walk into a room and make it feel like a foreign movie. She had that look, the dark hair, the quiet control, the way she spoke French like it was her native tongue. People looked at her and saw Paris. They saw old money. They saw a woman who had been polished by centuries of European aristocracy. But if you believe Jackie Kennedy was simply a product of French nobility, you are looking at a painting and missing the painter. You are seeing the image she built, not the history she lived. The truth is much sharper. Jackie was not the daughter of counts and dukes. She was the descendant of a cabinet maker who fled a revolution and the granddaughter of Irish immigrants who survived a famine. She was a woman who stood in the middle of a family tug-of-war between a glamorous myth and a gritty reality. And the biggest secret of all wasn't that her family lied about their past. It was that the truth they hid was far more impressive than the fairy tale they invented. To understand Jackie, you have to look at the man who gave her that famous last name, the Bouvier. Her grandfather, John Verneau Bouvier Jr., known as the Major, was obsessed with image. He didn't just want to be rich, he wanted to be important. In New York City, money was common, but lineage was power. So he decided to fix his family tree. He wrote a book about the Bouvier. He claimed they were descended from the ancient house of Fontaine near Grenoble. He invented coats of arms. He talked about illustrious families and noble bloodlines. He created a story where the Bouvier were practically French royalty who just happened to be in America. It was a beautiful lie. It was social armor. It told the world that the Bouvier belonged at the top because they had started at the top. But the records tell a different story about the man who actually started the American line. His name was Michel Bouvier, and he wasn't a nobleman. He was a survivor. Michel was born in France in 1792. He didn't grow up in a castle. He grew up in the chaos of the Napoleonic Wars. He was a foot soldier. When Napoleon fell in 1815, France became a dangerous place for men who had served him. Royalists were hunting down the old guard. The White Terror was sweeping the country. Michel faced a life or death problem. If he stayed, he risked prison or execution. His choice was total reinvention. He fled. He left behind everything he knew and crossed the Atlantic, arriving in Philadelphia around 1817. He didn't land with a fortune. He landed with a skill. Michel was a cabinet maker. He knew how to work with wood. In a new country, that was his only currency. He opened a small shop on 9th Street. He didn't have a coat of arms, but he had hands that could make beautiful things. He started building furniture for the wealthy. He was so good that he gained a client named Joseph Bonaparte, Napoleon's own brother, who was also in exile. He even crafted desks that ended up in the White House. Think about that connection. Long before Jackie redecorated the White House, her great-great-grandfather's work was already sitting in it. But Michel didn't stop at furniture. He saw that the city needed fuel. He started selling firewood. That sounds simple, but it led him to the land. He bought 800,000 acres of forest in Pennsylvania. Then he got lucky, or maybe just smart. That land was sitting on top of anthracite coal. By 1840, his coal royalties were paying him $50,000 a year. In today's money, that is about $1.4 million. Around every single year. Michel Bouvier didn't need a fake title. He built a real empire. He moved from a shop to a mansion on Broad Street. By the time he died, he was worth millions. He took a family that was running for its life and planted them firmly in the American elite. The Major, his grandson, should have been proud of that. Instead, he was embarrassed. He didn't want a carpenter for an ancestor, he wanted a count. So he erased the sawdust and painted in a crest. Jackie inherited the crest. She grew up with the myth. She learned that being French meant being refined, and being Bouvier meant being noble. She wore that identity like a shield. But there was another side to her family, one that was even harder to hide. Jackie's father was John Verneau Bouvier III, but nobody called him John. The world called him Blackjack. He was a man who lived for the mirror. He was incredibly handsome, with a thick mustache and slicked back hair. He looked like a movie star, specifically Clark Gable. But the thing people noticed most was his skin. He was dark. Very dark. Rumors started swirling. People whispered that the Bouvier had exotic blood. They said Blackjack must have African ancestry, or maybe he was Cherokee. In a time when racial lines were drawn in concrete, being swarthy was enough to start a scandal. The truth was less mysterious and more vain. Blackjack was obsessed with his tan. He used sun lamps. He spent hours outside. He cultivated that dark, bronzed look on purpose because he thought it made him look dangerous and dashing. He earned the nickname Blackjack partly because of his face, but mostly because of his life. He was a gambler. He drank too much. He chased women. He lived like a man who was trying to burn through his inheritance as fast as possible. Jackie adored him, but she also learned a hard lesson from him. Appearance is everything. Her father's dark looks and wild reputation taught her that if you don't control your image, strangers will invent one for you. People looked at him and made up stories about secret bloodlines. Jackie saw how easily a rumor could turn into a label. She would need that lesson later when she faced a trap that could have damaged her husband's presidency. In the 1960s, the civil rights movement was shaking America. Tensions were high. The one-drop rule, the racist idea that any amount of African ancestry made a person black, was a weapon used to segregate and shame. Suddenly, a genealogical society contacted Jackie. They had found something interesting in her family tree. They were looking at the Van Sale line. Anthony and Abraham Van Sale were early settlers in New Amsterdam. Their father, Jan Jansoen, was a Dutch pirate, and the rumor that had followed the family for centuries was that their mother had been a mixed-race woman from North Africa. The society wanted to publicize this. They thought it would be a good story. The First Lady has mixed heritage. They thought it might help JFK with race relations. Jackie saw the trap instantly. If she admitted to mixed blood, the press wouldn't treat it as a nice story about diversity. In 1960s America, it would become a political grenade. Her husband's enemies would use it. The gossip columns would run wild. So Jackie made a choice. She didn't ignore them. She redefined the story. She told them the Van Sales were Jewish. She knew that some members of that family had used Jewish identity in the past to avoid persecution. She grabbed that label and pinned it to herself. Jewish was safe. It was European. It stopped the questions about African blood without causing a scandal. She shut the door. The conversation ended. She protected the White House by editing her ancestors one more time. But the biggest edit in Jackie's life didn't happen in a history book or a press release. It happened in her own house, with her own mother. Janet Lee Auchincloss was a woman who had mastered the art of social climbing. She married Blackjack Bouvier, then divorced him, then married into the wealthy Auchincloss family. She moved through the highest circles of society. She told everyone she was a Lee of Virginia. That name meant something. It meant Robert E. Lee. It meant the old Southern aristocracy. It meant you were a Protestant, Anglo-Saxon, blue-blooded American. Janet played the part perfectly. She even served on the board of Stratford Hall, the ancestral home of the Virginia Lees. She let people assume she was related to the general. But Janet Lee was lying. She wasn't a Lee of Virginia. She wasn't a Protestant aristocrat. She was the daughter of Irish Catholics. Her parents, James Lee and Margaret Merritt, were the children of famine immigrants. They came from County Cork and County Clare. They hadn't arrived on the Mayflower. They had arrived on coffin ships, fleeing starvation. Janet's grandfather, Thomas Merritt, came from a village called Chandram. He wasn't a general. He was a man trying not to starve. Janet knew that in the elite world she wanted to join, Irish Catholic was a stain. It meant you were new money. It meant you were loud. It meant you didn't belong. So she hid it. She buried her history deep. The most painful part of this secret wasn't the lie itself. It was what she did to her own mother. Janet's grandmother was still alive. She had a thick Irish brogue. She sounded like the places she came from. When wealthy guests came to the house, Janet didn't introduce her grandmother. She sent her upstairs. She told people the old woman with the accent was a housemaid. She turned her own flesh and blood into a servant to keep her story straight. Jackie grew up watching this. She saw the Virginia Lee performance. She heard the stories about the glorious past. But unlike her mother, Jackie eventually went looking for the truth. In 1967, after JFK was gone, Jackie took her children, Caroline and John Jr., to Ireland. She didn't just go for a photo op. She visited the places where the Kennedys came from. She felt the pull of the land. She realized that half of her own blood, the Lee side, was just as Irish as the Kennedy side. The research showed that Jackie was roughly 50% Irish. Her mother's family was almost entirely Irish. The French Bouvier blood was actually quite thin, only about 12% by the time it got to Jackie. She came home and confronted Janet. You can imagine the scene. The daughter who had been the most famous woman in the world, standing in front of the mother who had spent a lifetime building a disguise. Jackie asked about the Merritts. She asked about County Clare. She asked about the famine. Janet denied it. She got angry. She heatedly insisted that the Virginia story was real. She refused to let the mask slip, even for her own daughter. It was Jackie's stepfather, Hugh Auchincloss, who finally broke the tension. He laughed and said he had always thought Janet was a Lee of Shanghai. He made it a joke, but the point landed. The Lee of Virginia story was over. Jackie didn't expose her mother to the press. She didn't humiliate her, but she stopped playing along. She realized that her strength didn't come from the fake French counts or the fake Virginia generals. It came from the people who had actually lived. It came from Michel Bouvier, who stood on a dock in Philadelphia with nothing but his tools and built a fortune from sawdust and coal. It came from the Merritts and the Lees, who survived the hunger that killed 1 million people in Ireland, crossed an ocean, and raised a generation that could dream of the White House. Jackie Kennedy spent her life being looked at. She was a symbol of perfection. But under the polish, she was the daughter of fighters and survivors. Her family tried to hide the struggle. They wanted to look like they had always been there, sitting on velvet chairs. But the truth is that Jackie's elegance wasn't a gift from the aristocracy. It was the armor she forged from a family history of reinventing themselves to survive. She was the granddaughter of a housemaid and the descendant of a carpenter, and she became the Queen of America. That is the story they should have told. It was the only one that was real.